if you make them too dynamic, they become fundamentally uninvestable. The dispersal of finance is done in a fair and equitable way. The jobs that they're creating, the healthcare, the education, there's much more than just carbon in all of these projects.
Welcome to Climate Hero Podcast. I think it'd be great to learn about your journey and also see your vision for future for your company. So let's start with your motivation. I noticed that you study orangutans, and how did that path led you to the world of carbon credit market and climate finance in general?
Sure. I mean, I don't think it's been a massive change, right? So previously, when I was younger, I did my PhD work studying orangutans, and then was working for conservation NGOs in Sumatra, right?
Yeah.
And we were doing integrated conservation and development, where you do a mixture of kind of traditional rangers and biodiversity monitoring, and then also what they call new conservation, which is more focused on people, community development activities, and creating alternative livelihoods so people don't cut down the forest, right?
Mm.
Um, but what I realized while I was doing that was that we were extremely inefficient
Yeah.
and often sort of beholden to donors and what their priorities were. And we'd be implementing programs that didn't necessarily have like a clear theory of change for what we were trying to achieve and why we were trying to do it and how we were going to do it, right?
Yeah.
I met a carbon developer called Wildlife Works and was sort of got to know them and eventually ended up working with them. But what I realized through that process was that
Mm.
when you go and develop a carbon project, you're following a very kind of structured pathway in terms of
Yeah.
developing the program through social biodiversity impact assessments and monitoring carbon, and ultimately having a profit and loss, balance sheet
Yeah.
that basically ensures that you're optimizing for efficiency in your operations, and also that everything has a very clear theory of change. And so for me, it was kind of a no-brainer, not just because carbon finance is a very good way of funding conservation and restoration,
That's right.
but also because it makes it kind of better. It makes you actually think about how you're implementing programs in a more structured way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And then, as a conservation biologist turned project developer, what blind spots do you think the carbon industry still has?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Going back a little bit to the NGO side, what I do think is when you're working for an NGO, we do really put the communities and the biodiversity at the center of what we're doing, right? And as I say, we might do inefficient things, but ultimately those are the key factors, right? I think when we look at carbon developers, oftentimes they can really focus on the carbon too much and really kind of oversimplify ecosystems and undervalue how important people are and how important biodiversity is and how important forests are for ecosystem services beyond carbon.
Mm. And then, can you break down what Natureverse is doing differently in the red and forest carbon space?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so up until now, we've really focused on IFM, right? Improved
Yeah.
forest management. And so that's very different to your traditional red projects that really focus on unplanned deforestation at a large scale. We're looking at forestry assets, so historic logging concessions in Indonesia that have been um either neglected because they're sort of operationally difficult to run, or
Yeah.
because the companies are undercapitalized, or because they've just sort of had a priority towards extraction rather than towards thinking about things in a more holistic way. Through an
Mm.
IFM framework, you don't generate as much carbon. It's not as sexy. You have some aspects of utilization, true like forestry, but you can also achieve quite big conservation benefits because they're large areas. There's revenue being generated from carbon, but also from forestry. You have kind of multi-use approaches that allow different uses of the landscape. And so in that
Mhm.
sense, I think you can get to something that's more sustainable, that integrates community needs as well as business needs and government needs, and sort of you have this kind of big integrated forest management process
Yeah.
that's quite cool and quite fun to be working on, I'd say.
Yeah, so you have worked in mapping, modeling, and field implementation for different projects. What part of the pipeline is most broken in your opinion, and how you are fixing it?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one, right? I think the mapping piece, the carbon quantification piece is relatively taken care of, right? A lot of people can do MRV in a bunch of different ways. I think the hardest thing and where we try and differentiate ourselves is in your actual ability to operate within a landscape, right?
Yeah.
So the company we manage in Indonesia has run these forestry assets for up to 30 years, right? They have long-term experience working with the communities. They have long-term experience understanding what the compliance regulations are for the government, and they have
Mm-hmm.
long-term experience sort of on the operational side. So whether that's building field infrastructure or, just running camps and stuff, right? We
Mm-hmm.
have that capacity. And so I
Yes.
think a lot of the time you see organizations that have a beautiful project, right? Really good carbon baseline, really interesting biodiversity, but they don't necessarily have that ability to operate. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
the operational piece is quite key, and
Yep.
and
Yep.
marrying that to community relations, government relations, like you really need that whole package to be able to actually develop a project.
Yeah, 100%. And then let's talk about trade-offs a little bit. How do you prioritize between carbon impact, biodiversity protection, and local livelihood goals?
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent we view them as being interlinked, right? If
Yep.
we don't just prioritize the carbon, and I think that's where we are a bit different, right? We're taking on some landscapes that, are not they're a bit suboptimal in terms of carbon returns,
Yep.
but they are significantly higher in terms of the biodiversity and community livelihoods. And so ultimately, I mean, I think it's a couple of things for us. One, we don't view it as a trade-off. We think
Mm-hmm.
by ensuring that we're protecting and quantifying biodiversity, and by making sure that we have fair benefit sharing and proper FPIC and really good community programs, this is going to increase the value of the carbon credits themselves, right? And ultimately, you can differentiate the units by having a product at the end that goes way beyond carbon and can really kind of demonstrate co-benefits
Yeah.
as an integral part of the project.
Let's come back a little bit on your answer on about management side, operation side of a carbon credit project. For yourself, how do you make sure that you can manage very good community relationships and local government relationships in general for your project?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm quite lucky with the company that I work for because we have those good long-term relationships. But I also think that like it's about being respectful and being inclusive and kind of adhering to local governance structures and meeting people where they are. I
Yeah,
think utilizing best practices for free prior and informed consent
yep,
and really viewing it as an ongoing process where social biodiversity impact assessments as a way to design the program and as a way to ensure that you get community buy-in and really understand through participatory mapping, okay, this is where the communities use the forest for non-timber forest products. This is where the community sort of wants to build shelter,
yeah,
housing, things like that. And then really making sure that the dispersal of finance is done in a fair and equitable way. So
yeah,
using things like community carbon trust
yep,
mechanisms that the company I previously worked for, Wildlife Works, pioneered in Africa.
yeah,
Using those kind of mechanisms, you can really ensure that the community both has ownership over how the finance is dispersed,
hmm,
but also that it's really transparent and it's really long lasting. Like you want the
yeah,
finance to be dispersed in a
yep,
sustainable way. You want it to be catalytic across multiple communities rather than and so by having these long-lasting kind of trust fund models, I think you can make sure that the money has kind of a multiplier effect
hmm.
within a landscape.
Yeah, from your what you share, I realize that the long-lasting, sustainable commitment is really important for this type of project. And what is the most challenging aspect of working with local communities from your experience so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most challenging part, I think, of working with local communities in my experience has been sort of wanting to meet everybody's needs,
Yeah,
and having to sort of match that desire with the realities both of the operational and financial needs of the company,
yeah,
but also of the regulatory and cultural environment that we have in Indonesia, right? The way that Indonesian tenure works,
yeah,
and land rights are handled, that makes kind of these community agreements can be a little bit more complicated in terms of making everybody happy. But in general, I'd say that, the communities, people are people, and it's all about listening to them and understanding what it is that they want, and going through iterative processes that, you can make a choice one year, then the
yeah,
next year you kind of look at how well did that work? Was that a good use of money? Is there
yeah,
anything that you'd like to change about the program? And by kind of going through that,
yeah.
um and understanding that it's a partnership, I think you can build much better community buy-in.
Yeah, and then in terms of, as you are running your project in Indonesia, I like to hear your thoughts on the key challenges with the market right now, because I've read about regulation, and I think there's still quite a lot of uncertainty around that. How does that impact the projects that you're building in Indonesia?
Yeah, it's very difficult, right? It is, we, since the last government came in, developing carbon credits in the forestry sector is one of their priorities.
Yeah,
Um, but I think, and we've seen a lot of progress, right? Um, but I think it's a very challenging regulatory reform process, right?
yep,
So we anticipate seeing mutual recognition agreement with various international standards coming soon.
yep,
And we anticipate a reform process of the regulations that govern carbon economic value, that govern carbon trading, and that also govern forest management, right?
yeah,
Um, Ultimately, I think the biggest challenge, right, is um, a government wants to see, revenue. They want to see transparent benefits from these projects. And until you have, and then there have been some extremely good examples in Indonesia.
yep,
But until you see those from a wider range of forestry projects, I think it's quite hard for them to understand what they're approving, how it's going to work, how do we kind of let this process go.
yeah,
But I also think our counterparts in the government, there's a lot of very technically smart people,
yep,
that are really, I mean, everybody's, it's a funny one where everyone is trying to do their best, right? Everybody has the common interest at heart, which is to meet Indonesia's NDC, to ensure kind of forest conservation, sustainable forest management, and restoration kind of are able to coexist.
yeah,
And realistically, they want to ensure that revenue is coming into the country, whether that's in the form of taxes, revenue sharing to government,
yep,
or to private sector actors that are then going to make more investments and are going to do more activities and are going to also pay tax, or whether that's in the sense of money going directly to communities living on the ground, right, and creating rural jobs and rural development. Like we're all aligned in terms of where we're trying to get to.
yep.
And so the hope is just that we can get to an agreement on the regulatory framework and have something very clear that allows kind of investments and projects to go forward.
Yeah, I'm quite optimistic about the new government. So I really want to see more solid and clear regulation around carbon credit for the market, because I think Indonesia is like one of the most carbon rich nation in the world, with a lot of forest. So there's a lot of opportunities around there. But back to our topic today, which is learning more about you and the projects that you're working on. What do you think are the most overlooked risk when scaling RAG and projects right now?
The biggest risks is
Yeah,
that. Yeah. So I mean, I think it's a couple of things, right? And it's sort of a bit counterintuitive in a way. So we've seen a lot of changes to carbon methodologies, and a lot of like focus has gone into Vera's new VM48, VM47, and a lot of focus on things like dynamic baselines.
yeah,
I think what's really overlooked there is that and you look at jurisdictional methods like art trees and things like that, which sort of introduce an element of dynamism. I think what's really overlooked with this move is that if you're trying to create long-term projects, right, and
Yeah.
these projects need to last a minimum of 40 years,
Mm.
if you make them too dynamic, they become fundamentally uninvestable. It sort of becomes an academic exercise where you're trying to quantify, flexes in carbon over time, but
Mm-hmm.
there's no way for the private sector but to participate in that, right? These are very large upfront investments
Yep.
that sort of have to be made with an element of predictability.
Yep.
And so I think a lot of the time we can focus on sort of scientific rigor.
Mm.
I mean, I have a PhD, so I'm familiar with sort of academic approaches, but it's not linked pragmatically to, is this going to enable projects to exist, right? Is this actually going to allow the generation of carbon credits? And I think there needs to be a bit of understanding that like you need kind of a minimum floor for how much carbon you're going to be generating or how many ecosystem services units you're going to be generating,
Yep.
just for the project to get off the ground, right? And I think there is a risk that by using these extremely dynamic methods, that unless pricing goes up significantly and unless buyers are sort of really willing to promise that they will kind of pay minimum amounts to ensure projects continue going, either
Mm-hmm.
projects just won't happen because nobody's going to want to invest in them, or
Yeah.
you'll have a series of projects that fail because if they're successful, their dynamic baseline drops and then they have nothing to they have no revenue.
Mm.
Um so I think that's a big risk that people don't really look at, right?
Yeah.
Um
Yeah.
and
I
so
agree.
that's a little bit why we like IFM. It's a bit less, up and down versus red per se. You sort of have the underlying baseline is based on a forest management plan. So how much logging would have been implemented? Do you
Mm.
do that logging better? Or do
Yep.
you not do that logging at all? Like there's a relatively low amount of carbon delta in that, but it just
Mm.
means that your variance is significantly lower, right? You're sort of dealing with something much more predictable, and
Yep.
as a result, much more investable.
Mm. Yeah, that's right. Since you mentioned revenue, I like to know your thought on um, integrity, not just in MRV, but like the business of selling impact in general.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think this is where tech can really help, right? You have a lot of new digital MRV providers, you have a lot of new satellites, and new data from biodiversity and things like that that can really be used to show integrity, right? And can really be
Mm.
used to show quality. I think, satellites, land cover, carbon stocks,
Yep.
land cover change can really be done across high areas with very high fidelity at this point in time, right?
Yeah.
You can really ensure that your buyer knows exactly where the carbon is, how much it's changing over time, what are the different risks, right? And then you start getting into like very high quality predictive risk mapping of where future emissions might occur from. I think what would be great is if other aspects of quality and integrity, really looking at the community piece and really looking at the biodiversity piece,
Mm.
could be prioritized in the same way, right? We really had so much focus on the carbon itself,
Yep.
but I think being able to quantify and really being able to speak for sustainable development benefits, right? Because this is where forest carbon projects are, or forestry and land use sector projects really are a bit unique, right? You have not just the carbon sequestration benefits, but also the jobs that they're creating, the healthcare, the education, the kind of indigenous rights piece can really be furthered through these projects. And then you
Mm.
also have the conservation benefits, so looking at biodiversity, looking at whether it's improving, looking at how the overarching kind of ecosystem structure can like benefit climate resilience. I think there's much more than just carbon in all of these projects, and it would be great
Mm.
if that kind of gets some more attention.
Yeah. Mm. Wow, I've learned a lot. Um, my final question for you would be, what's the long-term impact that you hope Natureverse will create?
Yeah, I mean, I think on a kind of micro level at the moment, our focus is really on getting these projects moving at a big scale and getting through validation and verification under the kind of new regulations in Indonesia. In the medium term, we really want to prove that the revenue can come and that the
Yeah.
benefits are being seen by communities and by the government. You have sort of money flowing in different ways, and also those sustainable development and conservation benefits that I was talking about earlier. Beyond that, really what we want to do is make sure that these landscapes are really kind of locked in for conservation and development over the long term, right? We want to see not just for the duration of a 40-year project, but that management licenses are going for up to 120 years, 30 years now, extend for another 90 years in future, and that there's really kind of a legacy play there in terms of ensuring that these forest landscapes, which are some of the most unique in the world, are sort of able to be protected and able to be maintained, for the foreseeable future, as kind of, and that they'll be able to continue to kind of mitigate and provide adaptation against climate change. I think that for us, that legacy piece is really, really important.
Yeah, that's a really big vision. And I think it's going to take time to build your vision and a strong team as well.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. But as I say, we're very, very, very fortunate that my colleagues working at Natureverse are very, very talented, and sort of we have a lot of great Indonesian staff that really, are going to be at the forefront of Indonesian forestry moving forward, and it's really fun getting to work on this kind of new business model with a historic forestry company.
Yeah. Where can people find you and connect with you to learn more about your projects?
Yeah, I'd probably say try and find me on LinkedIn at the moment. We haven't really pushed that much of our websites, a little bit in stealth mode kind of thing. So I think LinkedIn is probably the best. And yeah, please feel free to reach out.
Okay, great. We will spread the word. Thank you so much for your time, James.
Thank you, Sunny.